Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 563, A Great Case. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am well. I am so excited to be starting a book. Huh? Oh, and it's going to be an interesting one. But before we start the new book, I have a reference to previous books to play for you. This is a message from Tara Worster to Maya Daguerre. Hang on, here we go.
Hello, Heather. It is I, Tara Worster. I have the remains of a cold that I'm going to talk over, and I apologize if it irritates some people, but I finally have a moment to read my thank you letter to Maya Daguerre. Here it goes. Lady Maya Daguerre, greetings from a warm and soon-to-be stormy Middle Tennessee. I am sending you this heartfelt and genuine thank you. You have been a comfort throughout the many days of this pandemic. As I listen to North and South again for the third time, I stir soup because it's a comfort food, and we cannot have breakfast for dinner again for the third night in a row. I listen to the tenant of Wildfell Hall as I graciously patch the knees and bottoms of pajama pants that have been worn more times than I've washed them. Let's face it, we live in pajamas. And as I finished Northanger Abbey, I am tearing apart masks that I made in the beginning of the year as I sewed over 300 now for friends and family because my husband's work didn't stop. And hearing your voice, knowing that it's there and it's within reach was such a sigh of relief that I did not know I needed in a friend. Yes, you read audiobooks for a podcast, but we're a family. And knowing you're there to comfort and tell the tomfoolery of others is something I relied on a lot. So thank you. Thank you so very much for reading for Craftlit. And I hope that there are more books to come. Graciously yours, Tara Worster. Clarksville, Tennessee, August 2021. I hope you're having a great day, Heather. I did so good. I didn't cry. Yes. I will talk to you soon. I can't wait for the next book. And I hope you're having a great one. Bye.
In Tara's emotional state, I think she misspoke. Sense and Sensibility was Maya's first book for us, and North and South was Barbara Edelman. But the sentiment, I know, is still true. Maya's been awesome. And I am sure at some point after she's recovered that she will read for us again. Oh, it's been an interesting week. I started my new old job. Things have changed on my new old job. I'm still training contact tracers for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. However, this time it's under new leadership. And they're great. Everyone's great. And the best part is we got the band back together. Everybody's back. And I keep getting pinged on LinkedIn and email and Facebook that people who I worked with before are back to do more. Because, like I said, the people who voluntarily go after a job like contact tracing, where you know you are going to be abused on some of your calls and they're going to be hard and people are dying and it's a strange kind of work. They're just great people. Great, strange work and temporary work. They are just awesome. So it's been a week of happy in that way. It's been a week of real frustration in the world of technology. Holy smoke. Building a better, stronger, more secure digital work environment is tricky. and frustrating, but I think we've sussed it. So that's a happy. Our washing machine is still busted, although we know what broke and the part is being ordered. However, I have become intimately acquainted with laundromats again. Although I have found a nice one that actually has bar stools up front and very strong fans blowing on the bar stool seating. So I can sit there and have a coffee and draw while the stuff is in the wash and the dryer. Although the coffee cools off very quickly when it is being blown upon by, by a very strong fan. So I think tomorrow I will be taking my coffee in an insulated cup, a heavily insulated cup, but that's fine too. That just means I use one fewer cardboard thing in my life, and that's good. That's fine. I'm down with that. Those of you who were on the Zoom call Thursday night, Andrew survived the board meeting. It started out really well, and sane people spoke and said important things, and that was great. And then the wackadoodles started yelling, and one woman did in fact have to be escorted from the room by the police. It's so sad. It's so sad and it's so frustrating, and I just hope that this leads to better science education in our schools, because a lot of the problems come from people not knowing how to check their sources. And there are some people out in the world, and this is a caution to all of us. There are some people out in the world who have the job's title sounds like, well, they must be a scientist. And they have the word PhD after their name, so they must be a smart scientist. When in fact, their doctorates were in sociology, and they wound up having this scientific sounding job title because there are statistics involved in their job, and they are overseeing a lot of scientists, but they are not necessarily scientists themselves. And I've seen posts from people who fit that kind of bill on Facebook and elsewhere, who talk a good game, who are still pimping out hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, and the actual studies that have been done on both of these things are out there and available for free. So if you see somebody saying, well, I just don't understand why all of these so-called scientists are against things like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, please encourage your friends to be generous in doubting their and others' infallibility and follow up by finding the source material. It's actually not very hard to do. Instead of using Google, go to pubmed.gov, pubmed.gov. PubMed.gov will get you to a Google page that searches journal articles, medical biological journal articles. If you type in hydroxy and you start to type chlor, you will see the drop down of all the things that people have been searching lately that include that term. And hydroxychloroquine space coronavirus will be the second hit. If you click on that, you'll see that the first article that is linked to is about hydroxychloroquine. The second is about ivermectin. Open one of those journal articles, read the abstract that's at the top, read the methods sections. You want to find out how many people were involved in any study. If it's 30 people, that's not great. If it's 30,000 people, that's probably useful information. But then you have to look and say, okay, well, were they only studying people in the hospital? Were they only studying people in the hospital in New York City? Were they only studying women? Were they only studying people over the age of 65? All of these things can have an effect on the results. and give you an idea of whether or not the research is biased in any way or is applicable across the board. That's why it's important for people to follow up on these things and think critically about them. And we don't do a great job, or we haven't historically done a great job helping kids do that. I know towards the end of my teaching career in New York City, in history at least, they were starting, and science was starting to talk about using more and more primary source documents, which would be things like if you were going to do something in a science class, having kids read the primary source document would be having them read journal articles about the research that was done in order to learn about the thing that the kids were about to do. And learning how to read those journal articles is a skill set. The other thing to do is to check all the way down at the bottom, past the references sections of these journals, and see the discussion. If a document has been peer reviewed, you will see a discussion going on between the reviewers and the authors, where the reviewers will say, hey, there were problems with this, 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 and this, these 4 things. And then the authors will respond, okay, we fixed this, and this other thing, we adjusted the language to clarify because what you took away from it was not what we meant. So we think we've clarified that section. And you can read all of this, and that's awesome. Unfortunately, most of the things that are coming out about COVID are not peer reviewed because they're being released as soon as the research is being done. They do eventually, for the most part, get peer reviewed, and things have been pulled. There has been research that was done sloppily in the beginning, and those journal articles are no longer available because they were inaccurate. So there is gatekeeping that is going on, but it's always harder to reteach if things were taught incorrectly in the first place. And so those journal articles that have gotten yanked, there usually isn't a whole lot of fanfare about that. And therefore, people are left with these lingering images and ideas and thoughts about things that were, in fact, not accurate. So Andrew survived the board meeting. Only one person got removed. And as soon as she was removed, everybody settled down because she was the bad apple. So that was sad and unfortunate, and particularly sad for her kids. It's just sad all the way around. However, that aside, on the happy scale, Amy from New Zealand managed to make it home from Texas to New Zealand. She is now happily, safely in quarantine in New Zealand, in a hospital, not being fed well, but being fed. It'll improve. But she was exposed to coronavirus while in Texas. I know. I'm shocked that she could have been exposed in Texas. But her test results came back negative. She was allowed to get on the plane. Life is good. So there's some happy news for our larger Craftlet family. And now let's get to the Leavenworth case. Now we are going to be using LibriVox recordings for this book. I need to make a disclaimer at the beginning. Kevin Green did yeoman's service reading this book for LibriVox. He's lovely. He has a lovely voice. He does a really nice, subtle job with his characterizations. I really enjoyed listening to him 2 or 3 times now. And as lovely as his voice is, I have to warn you, this book was written by an American. This book takes place in New York City. Kevin Green is from the UK, and he reads the book like it takes place in London. All of that said, I don't care. I just don't care. And here's why. It's hard in the United States to communicate class and, well, in this case, because it's 1878, country of origin, because we still had such recent immigrants coming from places like Ireland. Kevin Green does a lovely job of communicating all of that by using British dialects. It's very hard in the United States to do it without falling into regional dialects, which at this time period probably wouldn't have been accurate. It probably would have been a lot closer to what he's doing, just a little bit more subtle. That you will hear references all throughout this book to Irish maids, Irish police, I'm trying to remember. There's another person who is Irish, and I'm blanking on who it is. But it's not, and I think I mentioned this last week, it's not like Elizabeth Gaskell's anti-Irish isms. This is more a statement of fact at the time in the New York region. A lot of Irish immigrants had come in, and a lot of them were in service jobs. And slowly, more and more Irishmen got into policing. So it's not a slur. It is what was going on at the time as far as jobs went. Anna Catherine Green gave us Shakespeare quotes at the beginning of each of her chapters. I think she stopped doing this after a while with the Mr. Gryce books. But here in our first, she is still doing that. And our narrator, who we immediately dive in with, is Mr. Raymond. So it is a first person narrative from Mr. Raymond, who is a lawyer. He is in the same firm as Mr. Veely. You will hear a lot of references to Mr. Veely early on in the book. You will meet Mr. Veely later. He's not just a pawn. He is a person in the story, if only briefly. But Mr. Raymond, the narrator, you don't hear his name very often because he's the one talking. But you do find out that that's who he is in today's chapters. Now we have 2 chapters today. The first chapter is called A Great Case. The second is called The Coroner's Inquest. That tells you pretty much what we're going to be listening to today. They are not particularly long chapters, but a lot does get communicated in them. In fact, I would probably suggest listening to the chapters twice, to be completely honest, because a lot of groundwork does get laid in here. I am letting you know in advance, listen closely to Mr. Raymond's description of how Mr. Gryce communicates. It is a running joke throughout all of the Gryce books. It is a piece of characterization that I love. Also, once we get to the coroner's inquest chapter, do pay attention to how closely the narrative resembles a modern CSI episode. And don't forget that the floor of the Pennsylvania legislature had an argument about whether this book could have been written by a woman. And the coroner's inquest scene, I think, is probably one of the reasons why they argued about it. It doesn't read like a woman from 1878 wrote it. It's kind of impressive. The other thing, just to put this all into perspective, I went and I looked up what were some other books that were written during the 1870s, during that decade. Here's a smattering. Anna Karenina, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, Black Beauty, Around the World in 80 Days, Middlemarch, Far from the Madding Crowd, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, A Doll's House, Ibsen, Demons by Dostoevsky, The Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy, Little Men by Louisa May Alcott, Daisy Miller by Henry James, Daniel Deronda by George Eliot, The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope, The Birth of Tragedy by Nietzsche, The Hunting of the Snark, also by Lewis Carroll, and it goes on and on and on and on. So it was kind of a good decade for literature, but I was blown away by the vast difference in kinds of books that were written. I mean, going from Tom Sawyer and Alice's Adventures in Wonderland all the way through Middlemarch and on to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and A Doll's House. That's an extraordinary range of literature. And somewhere in there is the Leavenworth case. It is a small and in many ways kind of homegrown piece of writing that lands in the middle of that list of masterworks. But as with so many things that were written by women at the time, it gets lost in the shuffle. I don't think it's any less important a thing to have read. I think it is probably more important in what grew out of it ultimately, but it's still fun. So I think that's all the warnings I'm going to give you. Let's listen to Kevin Green read us The Leavenworth Case by Anna Catherine Green, chapters 1 and 2. Here we go.
The Leavenworth Case by Anna Catherine Green. Book 1, The Problem, Chapter 1, A Great Case. A deed of dreadful note. Macbeth. I had been a junior partner in the firm of Veeley, Carr and Raymond, attorneys and counsellors at law, for about a year, when one morning, in the temporary absence of both Mr. Veeley and Mr. Carr, there came into our office a young man whose whole appearance was so indicative of haste and agitation that I involuntarily rose at his approach and impetuously inquired, "What is the matter? You have no bad news to tell, I hope?" "I have come to see Mr. Veeley. Is he in?" "No," I replied. "He was unexpectedly called away this morning to Washington. Cannot be home before to-morrow, but if you will make your business known to me—" "To you, sir?" he repeated, turning a very cold but steady eye on mine. Then, seeming to be satisfied with his scrutiny, continued, "There is no reason why I shouldn't. My business is no secret. I came to inform him that Mr. Leavenworth is dead." "Mr. Leavenworth!" I exclaimed, falling back a step. Mr. Leavenworth was an old client of our firm, to say nothing of his being the particular friend of Mr. Veeley. "Yes, murdered. Shot through the head by some unknown person while sitting at his library table." "Shot? Murdered?" I could scarcely believe my ears. "How? When?" I gasped. "Last night, at least so we suppose. He was not found till this morning. I am Mr. Leavenworth's private secretary," he explained, "and live in the family. It was a dreadful shock," he went on, "especially to the ladies." "Dreadful!" I repeated. "Mr. Veeley will be overwhelmed by it." "They are all alone," he continued in a low business-like way I afterwards found to be inseparable from the man. "The Mrs. Leavenworth, I mean, Mr. Leavenworth's nieces, and as an inquest is to be held there to-day, it is deemed proper for them to have some one present capable of advising them. As Mr. Veeley was their uncle's best friend, they naturally sent me for him, but he being absent, I am at a loss what to do or where to go." "I am a stranger to the ladies," was my hesitating reply, "but if I can be of any assistance to them, my respect for their uncle is such—" The expression of the secretary's eye stopped me. Without seeming to wander from my face, its pupil had suddenly dilated till it appeared to embrace my whole person with its scope. "I don't know," he finally remarked, a slight frown testifying to the fact that he was not altogether pleased with the turn affairs were taking. "Perhaps it would be best. The ladies must not be left alone." "Say no more. I will go." And sitting down, I dispatched a hurried message to Mr. Veeley, after which, and a few other preparations necessary, I accompanied the secretary to the street. "Now," said I, "tell me all you know of this frightful affair." "All I know? A few words will do that. I left him last night sitting as usual at his library table, and found him this morning seated in the same place, almost in the same position, but with a bullet hole in his head as large as the end of my little finger." "Dead?" "Stone dead." "Horrible!" I exclaimed. Then, after a moment, "Could it have been a suicide?" "No. The pistol with which the deed was committed is not to be found." "But if it was a murder, there must have been some motive. Mr. Leavenworth was too benevolent a man to have enemies, and if robbery was intended—" "There was no robbery. There is nothing missing," he again interrupted. "The whole affair is a mystery." "A mystery?" "An utter mystery." Turning, I looked at my informant curiously. The inmate of a house in which a mysterious murder had occurred was rather an interesting object. but the good-featured and yet totally unimpressive countenance of the man beside me offered but little basis for even the wildest imagination to work upon, and glancing almost immediately away, I asked, "Are the ladies very much overcome?" He took at least half a dozen steps before replying. "It would be unnatural if they were not." And whether it was the expression of his face at the time, or the nature of the reply itself, I felt that in speaking of these ladies to this uninteresting, self-possessed secretary of the late Mr. Leavenworth, I was somehow treading upon dangerous ground. As I had heard they were very accomplished women, I was not altogether pleased at this discovery. It was therefore with a certain consciousness of relief I saw a Fifth Avenue stage approach. "We will defer our conversation," said I. "Here's the stage." But once seated within it, we soon discovered that all intercourse upon such a subject was impossible. Employing the time, therefore, in running over in my mind what I knew of Mr. Leavenworth, I found that my knowledge was limited to the bare fact of his being a retired merchant of great wealth and fine social position, who, in default of possessing children of his own, had taken into his home 2 nieces, one of whom had already been declared his heiress. To be sure, I had heard Mr. Veeley speak of his eccentricities, giving as an instance this very fact of his making a will in favour of one niece to the utter exclusion of the other; but of his habits of life and connection with the world at large I knew little or nothing. There was a great crowd in front of the house when we arrived there, and I had barely time to observe that it was a corner dwelling of unusual depth, when I was seized by the throng and carried quite to the front of the broad stone steps. Extricating myself, though with some difficulty, owing to the importunities of a bootblack and a butcher's boy, who seemed to think that by clinging to my arms they might succeed in smuggling themselves into the house, I mounted the steps, and finding the secretary, by some unaccountable good fortune, close to my side, hurriedly rang the bell. Immediately the door opened, and a face I recognized as that of one of our city detectives appeared in the gap. "Mr. Gryce!" I exclaimed. "The same," he replied. "Come in, Mr. Raymond." And drawing us quietly into the house, he shut the door with a grim smile on the disappointed crowd without. "I trust you are not surprised to see me here?" said he, holding out his hand with a side glance at my companion. "No," I returned. Then, with a vague idea that I ought to introduce the young man at my side, continued, "This is Mr. Excuse me, but I do not know your name," I said inquiringly to my companion. "The private secretary of the late Mr. Leavenworth," I hastened to add. "Oh," he returned, "the secretary. The coroner has been asking for you, sir." "The coroner is here, then?" "Yes. The jury have just gone upstairs to view the body. Would you like to follow them?" "No, it is not necessary. I have merely come in the hope of being of some assistance to the young ladies. Mr. Veeley is away." "And you thought the opportunity too good to be lost," he went on. "Just so. Still, now that you are here, and as the case promises to be a marked one, I should think that, as a rising young lawyer, you would wish to make yourself acquainted with it in all its details. But follow your own judgment." I made an effort and overcame my repugnance. "I will go," said I. "Very well, then. Follow me." But just as I set foot on the stairs, I heard the jury descending. So, drawing back with Mr. Gryce into a recess between the reception room and the parlor, I had time to remark, "The young man says it could not have been the work of a burglar." "Indeed?" fixing his eye on a doorknob near by. "That nothing has been found missing." "And that the fastenings to the house were all found secure this morning." "Just so." "He did not tell me that. In that case," and I shuddered, "the murderer must have been in the house all night." Mr. Gryce smiled darkly at the doorknob. "It has a dreadful look," I exclaimed. Mr. Gryce immediately frowned at the doorknob. And here let me say that Mr. Gryce, the detective, was not the thin, wiry individual with the piercing eye you are doubtless expecting to see. On the contrary, Mr. Gryce was a portly, comfortable personage, with an eye that never pierced, that did not even rest on you. If it rested anywhere, it was always on some insignificant object in the vicinity, some vase, inkstand, book, or button. These things he would seem to take into his confidence, make the repositories of his conclusions. But as for you, you might as well be the steeple on the Trinity Church, for all connection you ever appeared to have with him or his thoughts. At present, then, Mr. Gryce was, as I have already suggested, on intimate terms with the doorknob. "A dreadful look?" I repeated. His eye shifted to the button on my sleeve. "Come," he said, "the coast is clear at last." Leading the way, he mounted the stairs, but stopped on the upper landing. "Mr. Raymond," said he, "I am not in the habit of talking much about the secrets of my profession, but in this case everything depends upon getting the right clue at the start. We have no common villainy to deal with here. Genius has been at work. Now, sometimes an absolutely uninitiated mind will intuitively catch at something which the most highly trained intellect will miss. If such a thing should occur, remember that I am your man. Don't go round talking, but come to me, for this is going to be a great case, mind you, a great case. Now, come on." "But the ladies?" "They are in the rooms above. In grief, of course, but tolerably composed for all that, I hear." And advancing to a door, he pushed it open and beckoned me in. All was dark for a moment, but presently, my eyes becoming accustomed to the place, I saw that we were in the library. "It was here he was found," said he, "in this room and upon this very spot." And advancing, he laid his hand on the end of a large baize-covered table that, together with its attendant chairs, occupied the centre of the room. "You see for yourself that it is directly opposite this door." And crossing the floor, he paused in front of the threshold of a narrow passageway opening into a room beyond. "As the murdered man was discovered sitting in this chair, and consequently with his back towards the passageway, the assassin must have advanced through the doorway to deliver his shot, pausing, let us say, about here." And Mr. Gryce planted his feet firmly upon a certain spot in the carpet, about a foot from the threshold before mentioned. "But," I hastened to interpose, "there is no room for 'but,'" he cried. "We have studied the situation." And without deigning to dilate upon the subject, he turned immediately about, and stepping swiftly before me, led the way into the passage named. "Wine closet, clothes closet, washing apparatus, towel rack," he explained, waving his hand from side to side as we hurried through, finishing with "Mr. Leavenworth's private apartment," as that room of comfortable aspect opened upon us. Mr. Leavenworth's private apartment! It was here, then, that it ought to be, the horrible, blood-curdling it that yesterday was a living, breathing man. Advancing to the bed that was hung with heavy curtains, I raised my hand to put them back, when Mr. Gryce, drawing them from my clasp, disclosed lying upon the pillow a cold, calm face, looking so natural I involuntarily started. "His death was too sudden to distort the features," he remarked, turning the head to one side in a way to make visible a ghastly wound in the back of the cranium. "Such a hole as that sends a man out of the world without much notice. The surgeon will convince you it could never have been inflicted by himself. It is a case of deliberate murder." Horrified, I drew hastily back, when my glance fell upon a door, situated directly opposite me in the side of the wall towards the hall. It appeared to be the only outlet from the room, with the exception of the passage through which we had entered, and I could not help wondering if it was through this door the assassin had entered on his roundabout course to the library. But Mr. Gryce, seemingly observant of my glance, though his own was fixed upon the chandelier, made haste to remark, as if in reply to the inquiry in my face, "Found locked on the inside. May have come that way and may not. We don't pretend to say." Observing now the bed was undisturbed in its arrangement, I remarked, "He had not retired, then?" "No. The tragedy must be 10 hours old. Time for the murderer to have studied the situation and provided for all contingencies." "The murderer? Whom do you suspect?" I whispered. He looked impassively at the ring on my finger. "Every one and nobody. It is not for me to suspect, but to detect." And dropping the curtain into its former position, he led me from the room. The coroner's inquest being now in session, I felt a strong desire to be present, so, requesting Mr. Gryce to inform the ladies that Mr. Veeley was absent from town, and that I had come as his substitute, to render them any assistance they might require on so melancholy an occasion, I proceeded to the large parlor below, and took my seat among the various persons there assembled. Chapter 2. The Coroner's Inquest. The baby figure of the giant mass of things to come. Troilus and Cressida. For a few minutes I sat dazed by the sudden flood of light greeting me from the many open windows. Then, as the strongly contrasting features of the scene before me began to impress themselves upon my consciousness, I found myself experiencing something of the same sensation of double personality which years before had followed an enforced use of ether. As at that time I appeared to be living two lives at once, in two distinct places, with two separate sets of incidents going on, so now I seemed to be divided between two irreconcilable trains of thought: the gorgeous house, its elaborate furnishings, the little glimpses of yesterday's life, as seen in the open piano with its sheet music held in place by a lady's fan, occupying my attention fully, as much as the aspect of the throng of incongruous and impatient people huddled about me. Perhaps one reason of this lay in the extraordinary splendor of the room I was in. The glow of satin, glitter of bronze, and glimmer of marble meeting the eye at every turn, but I am rather inclined to think it was mainly due to the force and eloquence of a certain picture which confronted me from the opposite wall. A sweet picture, sweet enough and poetic enough to have been conceived by the most idealistic of artists. Simple, too, the vision of a young flaxen-haired, blue-eyed coquette, dressed in the costume of the First Empire, standing in a wood path, looking back over her shoulder at some one following, yet with such a dash of something not altogether saint-like in the corners of her meek eyes and baby-like lips, that it impressed me with the individuality of life. Had it not been for the open dress with its waist almost beneath the armpits, the hair cut short on the forehead, and the perfection of the neck and shoulders, I should have taken it for a literal portrait of one of the ladies of the house. As it was, I could not rid myself of the idea that one, if not both, of Mr. Leavenworth's nieces looked down upon me from the eyes of this entrancing blonde with the beckoning glance and forbidding hand. So vividly did this fancy impress me that I half shuddered as I looked, wondering if this sweet creature did not know what had occurred in this house since the happy yesterday, and if so, how she could stand there smiling so invitingly, when suddenly I became aware that I had been watching the little crowd of men about me with as complete an absorption as if nothing else in the room had attracted my attention; that the face of the coroner, sternly intelligent and attentive, was as distinctly imprinted upon my mind as that of this lovely picture, or the clearer cut and more noble features of the sculptured Psyche, shining in mellow beauty from the crimson hung window at his right. Yes, even that the various countenances of the jurymen clustered before me, commonplace and insignificant as most of them were, the trembling forms of the excited servants crowded into a far corner, and the still more disagreeable aspect of the pale-faced, seedy reporter, seated at a small table and writing with a ghoul-like avidity that made my flesh creep, were each and all as fixed an element in the remarkable scene before me as the splendour of the surroundings, which made their presence such a nightmare of discord and unreality. I have spoken of the coroner. As fortune would have it, he was no stranger to me. I had not only seen him before, but had held frequent conversation with him, in fact knew him. His name was Hammond, and he was universally regarded as a man of more than ordinary acuteness, fully capable of conducting an important examination with the necessary skill and address. Interested as I was, or rather was likely to be, in this particular inquiry, I could not but congratulate myself upon our good fortune in having so intelligent a coroner. As for his jurymen, they were, as I have intimated, very much like all other bodies of a similar character, picked up at random from the streets, but from such streets as the Fifth and Sixth Avenues. They presented much the same appearance of average intelligence and refinement as might be seen in the chance occupants of one of our city stages. Indeed, I marked but one amongst them all who seemed to take any interest in the inquiry as an inquiry, all the rest appearing to be actuated in the fulfilment of their duty by the commoner instincts of pity and indignation. Dr. Maynard, the well-known surgeon of 36th Street, was the first witness called. His testimony concerned the nature of the wound found in the murdered man's head. As some of the facts presented by him are likely to prove of importance to us in our narrative, I will proceed to give a synopsis of what he said. Prefacing his remarks with some account of himself, and the manner in which he had been summoned to the house by one of the servants, he went on to state that upon his arrival he found the deceased lying on a bed in the second-story front room, with the blood clotted about a pistol wound in the back of the head, having evidently been carried there from the adjoining apartment some hours after death. It was the only wound discovered on the body, and having probed it, he had found and extracted the bullet, which he now handed to the jury. It was lying in the brain, having entered at the base of the skull, passed obliquely upward, and at once struck the medulla oblongata, causing instant death. The fact of the ball having entered the brain in this peculiar manner he deemed worthy of note, since it would produce not only instantaneous death, but an utterly motionless one. Further, from the position of the bullet hole and the direction taken by the bullet, it was manifestly impossible that the shot should have been fired by the man himself, even if the condition of the hair about the wound did not completely demonstrate the fact that the shot was fired from a point some 3 or 4 feet distant. Still further, considering the angle at which the bullet had entered the skull, it was evident that the deceased must not only have been seated at the time, a fact about which there could be no dispute, but he must also have been engaged in some occupation which drew his head forward. For, in order that a ball should enter the head of a man sitting erect at the angle seen here, of 45°, it would be necessary not only for the pistol to be held very low down, but in a peculiar position, while, if the head had been bent forward as in the act of writing, a man holding a pistol naturally, with the elbow bent, might very easily fire a ball into the brain at the angle observed. Upon being questioned in regard to the bodily health of Mr. Leavenworth, he replied that the deceased appeared to have been in good condition at the time of his death, but that, not being his attendant physician, he could not speak conclusively upon the subject without further examination, and to the remark of a juryman observed that he had not seen pistol or weapon lying upon the floor, or indeed anywhere else in either of the above-mentioned rooms. I might as well add here that he afterwards stated that from the position of the table, the chair, and the door behind it, The murderer, in order to satisfy all the conditions imposed by the situation, must have stood upon, or just within, the threshold of the passageway leading into the room beyond. Also, that as the ball was small and from a rifled barrel, and thus especially liable to deflections while passing through bones and integuments, it seemed to him evident that the victim had made no effort to raise or turn his head when advanced upon by his destroyer, the fearful conclusion being that the footstep was an accustomed one, and the presence of its possessor in the room either known or expected. The physician's testimony being ended, the coroner picked up the bullet which had been laid on the table before him, and for a moment rolled it contemplatively between his fingers, then drawing a pencil from his pocket, hastily scrawled a line or two on a piece of paper, and calling an officer to his side, delivered some command in a low tone. The officer, taking up the slip, looked at it for an instant knowingly, then catching up his hat, left the room. Another moment, and the front door closed on him, and a wild halloo from the crowd of urchins without told of his appearance in the street. Sitting where I did, I had a full view of the corner. Looking out, I saw the officer stop there, hail a cab, hastily enter it, and disappear in the direction of Broadway.
All right, so we've learned some important things. Mr. Gryce has intimate conversations with inanimate objects. There are several times when I read this the first time where I laughed out loud at Mr. Raymond's commentaries about where Mr. Gryce is looking and what kind of a relationship he was having with that particular inanimate object at the time. I never got tired of it. It may have been a gag, but I have a sneaking suspicion because she does such a good job with it and has such an easy time of doing it consistently that there must have been a detective that she knew because of her dad who behaved this way. And it's also a really important character trait that many of us, I have heard from you, and even I from time to time, and I know my kids from time to time. We can't make eye contact with human people, with human faces, if we're trying to think hard. Human faces are too interesting, and there's too much going on. And if your brain is focused on solving a problem or thinking through something, sometimes that's information overload, and you need to not be looking at a person. There was an actress I worked with who could not look at your face or make eye contact on stage when she was speaking. She couldn't remember lines if she did. So she'd look at your forehead or kind of up and to the side. She could look at your eyes when you were speaking, but when it came time for her to talk, she had to look away. And it was the same thing. So I think it's a fabulous characterization element to Mr. Gryce. I also think Mr. Gryce is just fascinating because she predictively says he is not thin and wiry. He's not an individual with a piercing eye. He's not Sherlock Holmes. She has described what Sherlock Holmes would be like in 10 years. Mr. Gryce is not that man. He's portly, he's comfortable. He has an eye that never pierces, except when it's looking at an inkstand that he takes into his confidence. I just do love that. Him being on intimate terms with the doorknob. I also loved Mr. Gryce's "Who do you suspect? Everyone and no one. It is not my job to suspect, but to detect." It was just a lovely way to put it in the beginning and lay it out there for you. This is Mr. Gryce. He is never going to settle on an answer and then pursue proof of that answer. He is only going to allow the proof to constantly change his mind and update his logical structure that he's built out for who could have done it, which I love. We have also learned that the pistol is nowhere to be seen, and that when Mr. Leavenworth was killed, he must not have been surprised at the sound of footsteps behind him. He must have recognized them because he did not lift his head. The angle at which the bullet entered his brain was such that his head really must have been leaning over his desk, writing. And that tells us a lot about who was able to walk into the room and do this. We also have learned from Mr. Raymond that there's a painting of a very, very, very pretty lady in the room. Her description is something to pay attention to. Flaxen-haired, a blue-eyed coquette, dressed in the costume of the First Empire. So this is Jane Austen Regency style clothing that the girl is wearing. She's in a forest, a little wooded lane. So it's very much neoclassical painting of a beautiful young woman. And he said he feels that either one or both of the nieces were looking down on him. We still haven't met the nieces, but they're who he's supposed to be there for and to help. Of course, they wouldn't be at the inquest itself because that would be inappropriate for young women to be at. Now, if Marion from The Woman in White were involved, you know she would have been sitting in the front row of the inquest. But neither of these girls are Marion. Although Mr. Raymond does start to give me Walter Hartwright vibes pretty quickly once the girls do get involved into the story. And you'll see some of that coming next week, I think. And that's it. That's it for me. I'm going to go to work and then I'm going to do laundry tomorrow and make a mask or two. And I think that's it. Paint some. How about you? Be well, take care of each other, wear a mask, get your vaccination, and I'll talk to you soon. All right, take care. Bye. If you like what you hear on Craftlit, please review us on iTunes, like us on Facebook, join in the fun in our Facebook group, which is Craftlit Annotated Audiobooks. Always the nicest group of people you're going to find on Facebook, and the place where you can come to and say, nobody else was going to understand this, but I knew you all would. And of course, thank you for your support of Craftlit. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.